Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories. And today we're discussing the cutting edge technology used to tell the story of Pharrell Williams. I'm talking, of course, about Lego and the new animated documentary, Piece by Piece, directed by Morgan Neville, who joins us on the show today, as well as supervising sound editor Al Nelson and re-recording mixer Pete Horner. I saw this film premiere at a surprise screening at the Telluride Film Festival, and I thought, wait, what is this movie? A documentary about Pharrell made with Lego pieces? But within the first 3 minutes, I was hooked. It really works, and the animation style opened up so many interesting storytelling possibilities. It's such a unique approach that I really wanted to start our conversation by asking Morgan just how this Lego idea initially came up and how Pharrell talked him into it.
It came in the first, 2 minutes of us talking about doing something. Because the pitch in his mind from the beginning was, if I'm going to do this, let me do it in a way that feels like an opportunity for creativity rather than just kind of regurgitating what he did. And honestly, when he said it, I had the same reaction. Rather than doing, I've done a lot of music documentaries, but it just felt like, oh, that's a whole new challenge. Like there's a whole new mountain to climb by trying to make a film like that, whatever it was going to mean, which we didn't know in the beginning.
Well, I'm curious, Al and Pete, the idea of telling this story through Lego animation, what possibilities did that open up for you in terms of sound design and how you were going to tell this story through sound?
We're fortunate that we've been working with Morgan for a long time, and we got to hear about this very unique idea when Morgan was here on the Anthony Bourdain Roadrunner documentary. And he showed us a couple of clips, and we were like, yes. I remember Pete and I were pretty giddy when we spoke to each other afterwards. And when we were seeing it, it was still, some of it was still actual documentary production, and some of it was Lego. And so we were a little like, what are we going to do with this?
Yeah, I think it was just very exciting, very freeing to work in this form, because it's documentary, but it's also animation. I feel like it, in a sense, like raised the bar for us. Like we have to make this even more special. But we could still reach for all of the language of a documentary sound, so our palette was in a way wider.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I definitely had that question, like from a sound approach, were you approaching it as a documentary or as an animated film? And it sounds like you actually kind of seized the best of both worlds.
Yes.
And used the entire possibility in the palette.
Yeah, I feel like we always need a bit of permission from the screen, like from the image. And so one of the things with documentary sound is if the image is degraded, then the sound can be degraded. But here we were with pristine images, so we kind of had to raise the bar there in terms of the sound quality, except of course there's a scene where they are playing back a cassette recording. But fortunately, Morgan put in a shot of a cassette playing, and so we were able to play it, with its rough sound. But yeah, I think we're always kind of looking to the image.
One thing about that, there are two little sequences where we have footage, and I don't think I've told anybody this yet, but we actually exported our 4K animation and exported it to VHS and re-imported it. So that footage actually went onto a VHS tape and came back into the film. So I think that might be a first.
That is garage filmmaking at its finest right there.
It's probably the most expensive way possible to make a VHS looking image. But yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because you do have so many different kinds of formats going on, and you do have this touch of like archival. You make it look like archival through transferring it to VHS and then bringing it back. We talk on this podcast a lot about the first 10 minutes of a movie and sort of the duty that the filmmaker has to get the audience on board and kind of explain the cinematic language that they're going to use to tell the story. There is so much that happens in the first 10 minutes of this movie, even just from when I saw it at Telluride, those logos come up at the beginning and that music is so full and so present, like, immediately this is going to be a very music forward journey, which is no surprise. But there's so much going on in that first 10 minutes. So Morgan, can you just talk, even the meta approach of, you have your first conversation with Pharrell in which you're talking about, and you're in there about how you're going to shoot these interviews. Like, tell me about that approach to the first 10 minutes and what you felt you had to like get the audience in to let them know what this journey is that they were going to take.
Well, I mean, as you suggest, when you try and tell somebody about this film, it's very difficult. People don't quite understand all these random ingredients you're putting together into one film. And I knew we had to tackle that at the beginning of the film. And so we had a version of the conversation that we had when we first talked about the film, where I, as a character, which I've never done in one of my films before, actually I realized by putting me in as a character, and I'm a surrogate for the audience, where you're kind of saying, well, what are we doing here? How's this going to work? Like, what are the rules?
Quiet on the set.
Hey, Pharrell.
Hey, how you doing, man? It'd be cool is if we told my story with Lego pieces.
Seriously?
Yes.
Lego.
Just be open.
Because I feel like we had to set the rules for the film up early on. So in the first couple of minutes, we open up on the logos. Originally, I had some score there, and Pharrell sent this random piece of music. Like he got very charged up and started sending me random snippets. And he sent this piece that he composed for the open, where it just says, it's happening, it's really happening. And it's like this, it's his own enthusiasm for this movie. And he composed this piece, which is just such a, like, okay, wake up, folks, we're going to go there. And that plays over the opening credits. And then it ends and we go right into this very long take that is completely documentary. So the camera is going down a hallway and it's dark, and then we're cutting off Pharrell's head, and then we're racking focus and we're missing focus, and then we're not seeing this, and we're hearing people talking, and the kids are jumping on the couch, and then we're walking down a hallway and we go in to where we're filming and we have this whole conversation. So that one shot to me was also about telling the audience, this is not what you're used to. Like, the rules of this are going to be different. That has the grammar of documentary right there. And then once we sit down in the chair and we start to have this conversation about what's this film, Pharrell says, well, use your imagination, think about what you can do with Lego pieces. And suddenly we jump into outer space and we're flying through planets. So as to your point, like right in those first 5 minutes, really, we've established a whole bunch of different kinds of storytelling, and that's so much of what the film is playing between these gears of a more kind of documentary or realistic storytelling, and then this fantastical storytelling, and to me, the music, of which there's a lot of music, kind of unlocks this gear of kind of anything can happen. We can get really crazy, and then suddenly it comes right back to something that's literally a one-to-one translation of documentary footage.
Yeah, I was curious, Morgan, to hear about your approach to the production then, because when I was taking a look at the movie again and watching that first sequence, I was like, well, okay, well, maybe this was sort of a conventionally shot and edited documentary, and then they just do a Lego animation overlay and replace that stuff. But I have a feeling you're going to tell me that it was a bit more complicated, the approach, than just shooting a straightforward documentary and then animating it with Lego.
Yeah, it was. There were a couple of reasons. One is we really started production in January of 2020, and then COVID hit, and I'd done a couple of interviews with Pharrell first before then, in person. But then we just started doing audio interviews remotely as everybody was doing things. And then I just said, well, this is actually a good time for me to do all my interviews. So everybody was home and around. So most of the interviews in the film happened with me at home on my couch, talking to people either on Zoom or sometimes on the telephone. And I just made sure we got good audio. Some of them had home studios. Sometimes I'd send a sound person to their house, at that time, very masked, and they would wait outside maybe. I remember one of the very first interviews we did, this is very early pandemic, I FedExed a Zoom recorder to Missy Elliott. And then I had to talk her through how to make it work. And I have to say that we needed some work on that in post to clean up that audio.
Enter Pete Horner.
Well, that was my next question for Al. What was getting all that different kinds of material, and what were some of the more challenging bits to work with?
Yeah, well, as Morgan said, it's a lot of everything. It's very much a documentary, and we wanted to definitely be true to that style. And what I think is awesome about this is that a lot of the audio is, when you watch an animated movie, everything's so clean and it's all been replaced. And with this, we've got the kind of raw reality of a lot of the material that was shot either, with actual cameras in production, or even with this Zoom in a window in New York or whatever. It's got that gritty reality to it. And so that's the basis of the film. But then on top of that, and, documentary sound is usually like, okay, let's put some ambiences in there and fix up the dialogue, and we'll see from there what else we can add. We got to put Foley in this documentary. That opening sequence that we were discussing, all the kids jumping around and us moving through down the hallway. That was all performed with Foley artists, and then we added special ambiences. We added a lot of stuff that you don't get to normally do with a documentary. So we start with that base layer of documentary, but then from there, we started getting more and more cinematic based on what the opportunities were, and up until where we're flying through space and down underwater, we got to do movement sounds and things that you don't normally get to do for a documentary. So it was all the cool stuff combined.
Morgan, I wanted to ask you. I mean, you're known in your documentary work for exploring the creative process, and very often working with musicians. I'm a big fan of Song Exploder, which is your awesome show detailing how music is made by really diving deep on a specific track in each episode. So I'm wondering if that approach and your experience on that show kind of informed how you wanted to approach Pharrell's music in this piece.
I mean, it's all kind of how I look at how stuff is made, and it's funny. I did a show with Mark Ronson called Watch the Sound, which is looking at how different technologies have influenced music creation. But even if you look at 20 Feet from Stardom, it's a film about taking apart songs we know and actually listening to them differently by looking at this one element that changes them, that we don't really think about because it's literally in the background. So I always love not only the creative process, but being able to take something familiar and giving you some new insight into it, so you think of it differently afterwards. Like you're always going to hear these things a little bit differently. Drop It Like It's Hot, you're always going to think of differently when you hear it. The Snoop song from the film. So, I think that's just how I like storytelling. And, this film had so many opportunities for that, and more than a documentary. Normally, because of animation, I felt like we could, time and space travel. So once you take the stems of a song and you take it down to an ISO vocal, it's like you're there in the booth with somebody, and you can kind of create those moments in a way that I could never do in a documentary. Typically, to really put you there as a viewer. So that kind of freedom I got incredibly excited by, because normally we have so many constrictions, but, both in terms of what I could do with sound, but also particularly with Pharrell, what I could do visually with sound, both in terms of creating the synesthesia effect, which, he sees color when he hears sound, and that we could actually see that, and by creating the beats. So the beats of the songs are actually represented by physical objects of color too. So like that from a storytelling point of view was great. And then bringing it to these guys to mix it and trying to figure out, what does synesthesia sound like, or what did the beats sound like? And I know there was a lot of work done on that too. So that was all kind of fresh ground for me to explore.
With regard to Song Exploder and See the Music and all that, one of my favorite parts of this mix experience was each day was an episode or multiple episodes of Song Exploder sitting with Pete. Pete would get this music and he would have all of the elements and he would work through them. It's like here's the percussion, here's the leads, here's the vocals. And Pete is listening to each one and deciding, where am I going to put it? What am I going to do with it? And getting to experience this amazing music in that kind of intimate way and really get to analyze it was just like, oh my gosh, can you believe what he's doing here with this or with this? And then Pete would take it and put it somewhere. So it was, that was very inspiring and enjoyable.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because we do have a couple of clips from the studio that I want to present, and we can dive a little deeper into it. And one of them is the first time that we get a sense in the film that Pharrell has synesthesia. So this is it's a clip called "I Love Music," and he's a kid and he's hearing this Stevie Wonder song.
And I loved music. Like everybody loves music, but I'm realizing I had a different kind of relationship with it. Like it was literally mesmerizing to me. I didn't even know that I was mesmerized. I just thought that's what all black kids did. I thought we all just stared into the speaker like, whoa. Looking back on when I was a little nappy-headed boy. I was seeing colors. It's called synesthesia. It's not something that you see with your physical eyes. It's something that you see in your mind's eye. Trying your best to bring the water to your eyes, thinking it might stop her from whipping you behind.
Al and Pete, I would love to hear kind of your approach to like what this concept of synesthesia and being able to see, sounds and music is so brilliantly, visually illustrated in the film. How did you approach that material from a sound design and mix perspective?
When Stevie Wonder is playing, there's only one thing you're supposed to do, and that's get the heck out of the way. So for certain scenes, the music does exactly what the music is doing, which is it is filling that space as much as it can and telling that story that way. And the Stevie Wonder moment is an epic example of just how music can move you and how it moved Pharrell. In other instances, there were, tangible events happening. The beats were jumping around. We were swooping through space. Things were happening that were clearly like Pharrell's imagination put to picture. And so we got to play with that sonically. And sometimes it dropped right in there. And we definitely paid attention to what is the music doing and how can we support it with sounds that work with the visuals without getting in the way of the music or diminishing the music. And it was really fun to sit with Morgan and audition ideas and try things with the beats as they're hopping around and jumping around, and have Foley try and do different things. We had one of our Foley artists is a percussionist, and so he did some amazing stuff with what we were watching. And, trying to go a little more 3D with the sound so that it sat with the music. That was sort of the sound design approach.
In some cases, the synesthesia is represented visually on the screen, and so Al did some really cool sound design for those. It was just a matter of blending it. He had already made it very musical, and so I just was able to blend it with the music, so it became one thing. I think the other approach that I had to synesthesia, thinking about the Stevie Wonder, it's almost more the Atmos sound field, being able to use, starting with it up on the screen in the home stereo. And then I think partly the synesthesia is an overwhelming of the senses, and so that's something that I can do with Atmos, thinking about sound field, like pulling it into the room, surrounding us, overhead, behind us. And then also just thinking about, frequencies and level, what am I hitting and where am I, stimulating to get this sort of sensory overload feel that I think the way it's presented in the movie and, the way I want it to be experienced is just kind of euphoria. It's just, he's just completely immersed in Stevie Wonder, and so, yeah, it was tremendous fun to take these things apart and put them back together. And as I was saying, and it's just that's kind of my little playground. So it was a lot of fun.
You bring up something interesting that I wanted to ask you about. Al, you brought it up, and then Pete, you just said the same. So, obviously you have a lot of Pharrell's music in the film, and so I'm kind of curious. Was he involved in the mixing process at all? And were you able to? It sounds like you were able to open up his tracks and kind of play and work with that material in a more unfinished state and kind of reimagine it for the film. My question was, were you able to do that, or is Pharrell's music kind of in a no-fly zone that like you just need to put the faders up and like let it play?
No, I think he gave us tremendous freedom. He didn't attend the mix, but he did send someone from his team who he works closely with.
Mike Larson's his longtime engineer who came for the mix.
Who I think engineers pretty much everything he does. And so, yeah, Mike came and he had all of the elements. They had already provided a lot of splits for us, but if we needed something else, like the vocal a little drier or something like that, he just found it and gave it to us. And he had great ideas too. I think, he was, representing Pharrell's interests, and luckily they were very much in line with what we wanted to do. So, no, it was literally just a big playground for us.
It sounds like you guys had too much fun making this movie.
It was too much. We're going to try to have less fun next time, but this one was fun.
Yeah. The only thing I'll say is, that animation is such a slow, methodical process. I have so much respect for animators now. I mean, it's literally years of daily work of just shot by shot, looking at things again and again. And it's just such a slow grind to get it visually to where you want it. So by the time you go into mix, suddenly it's like you've been preparing all these elements, and then it just speeds up, and then it feels more like we've been preparing the symphony, and then we get to actually kind of hear it all come together. It's like that moment when suddenly all the shots that have been trickling in and all the little elements finally come together, and so it's really one of my very favorite parts of the process. And this was such a bigger swing for me, both as a film, but even as a mix, and knowing that these guys have such experience doing all kinds of big movies, big movies, and they've always kind of been nice to come do my small movies. So, this was a chance for, for me to play in a different way, but to play with collaborators who understand all these things. So it was really, just one of my very favorite parts of making this film.
I definitely wanted to ask you about this hybrid mixture of documentary and animation. You just said it took a long time, but I feel like one of the things that surprised me about the film is I felt like having the ability to tell part of the story visually through animation actually opened up a lot of storytelling possibilities that would not have been available to you in a conventional documentary. You talked about the Snoop Dogg sequence, and we do have a clip from that I want to play.
This is beautiful work that you've been doing.
Thank you, man.
This is what I want, though, P. I'm waiting on a hit record. Feel what I'm saying? One of them bad, mad Majama. That song that you did with Jay-Z, I told somebody the other day, I said that should have been my mom.
First of all, Snoop is very tall. And then he's in the studio with like 15 Crips who are all 6'5". You ever been in a city where you could see the fog really low? That's what it was like. Snoop has mystical vibes. I'm just like channeling him. So I made that beat out of my mind.
Part of what you've explored as a filmmaker is the creative process, which is really hard to get to represent visually. How do people create? And so I would love for you to talk about maybe using that Snoop Dogg sequence. What possibilities for you were unlocked about exploring how creators create visually because of the animation?
One thing that was a little bit different on this film in terms of my process, I mean, there were a lot of things different, but just in terms of my interviewing process is, I would talk to, say, Pharrell about a song like Drop It Like It's Hot. And he started to tell a story, and I would just say, well, why don't we really dig into that? Like, paint the picture for me, like, what was the studio like? What it looked like? What was the scene like? What did he say to you? What did you say to him? And I kind of asked everybody to paint more of a picture than they normally would. And they did, and that song in particular is such an odd song. It's based off of this strange kind of, a beat, which really is based off of just vocal sounds, clicking, mouth clicks and things, and the spray can. And when you go back to the stems of that, which we did in the edit, and you just think, oh, that whole song, there's at some point in time, Pharrell was sitting in front of a mic or sitting in the studio, just clicking his mouth, and that led to something. And so being able to go back and kind of reconstruct those tiny little elements that are so odd and kind of pointing out their oddness by seeing them, and then starting to layer the song on it as they did, and seeing it then kind of blossom, into the song people know. That was a kind of creative exploration that I, normally can't do. So that was just incredibly liberating for me creatively. And I mean, this film obviously gave me so many more levers of creativity than I normally have. And so I wanted to use all of them as much as I could. So, I do feel, again, like there's this documentary gear, and maybe a quarter of the film is based on real footage, that we went back to the projects, the Atlanta's housing projects where Pharrell grew up. We filmed that scene, or I filmed interviews with his parents and his wife, and some with Pharrell, and we had music videos and we had archive footage. But most of it, we're inventing something from scratch, and sometimes that's based on real things and real locations. And sometimes we're just making it up, and that was great. And what was interesting in the Lego of it all is that you don't feel the gear shifts. Often in a documentary, like say my Mr. Rogers documentary that we all did together, there are animation sequences in there, and documentaries often will have an animation sequence. And, there's such a shift when you go into those sequences. But here, you don't even notice the shift when it goes from something that's more realistic to something that's fantastical, and I wasn't even sure how that was going to play, but that was like one of the great surprises. It's all part of just the same world, no matter what you do.
Al and Pete, I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about that Snoop Dogg sequence. And, as Morgan mentioned, it was really a great kind of unpacking of the creative process about the very kernels of the beginning of what that sounded like with the mouth sounds and whatnot. And were you able to build that sequence based on the stems that you had from the song, or did you have to go back and create some stuff in order to sort of, stage the magic happening?
Mostly we used the Snoop tracks and the Pharrell tracks there. And again, we had Mike there to track down things. I remember one of the things we had fun doing was, as Morgan is saying, let's create the atmosphere. So it was fun to create this atmosphere of the studio. So there's like this kind of trippy ambience that kind of comes in before the music starts, and we kind of put us into Snoop's vibe. And so it was fun to kind of first let the music lead, and then go from both what the music is saying thematically and in its own unique way, and also where are we and what are we doing and how can we put the audience there sonically. And so it was a great blend of first creating this atmosphere, and then Pete, again, going into his playground and like, here are the mouth clicks, and here are the vocals, and here's this, and here's this, and then that beat comes in, and man, that beat with the subwoofer, we really leaned into that. So it was a balancing act. But again, like almost every song, the song was the structure, the song was the lead, and then what do we do around that to help bring the scene to life in other ways?
Yeah, I think there was also, I think just in terms of the elements, there was some like in studio recording. So we kind of, used some of that. And then I think some of the sound effect, like you said, the atmosphere was, sort of the general spray, spray can and the misty ambience. And, so we can start in this sort of like less specific sound field. And then we can go just to the spray can and then just drop in the beat and just drop in the lyrics. And then it like at a certain point, it just all drops in and there's the song, but you're kind of like teasing it.
I love the way you guys use sound design to kind of make a very playful tone. This movie has a lot of joy in it. And I think that you really leaned into some of the possibilities of sound design to bring that joyful tone in it. There's some sequences that I just love. There's that great scene where Pharrell's young and he goes to New York for the first time. He meets Rob Walker that he has this kind of phone relationship with. He plays him a track, on the street, and Rob's head literally gets blown off. And then he puts his head back on. There's this great, very satisfying like thunk when he puts his head back on and he says like, this is great. And I just love just the playfulness of the sound design and how you guys leaned into, just the possibilities for using sound to set the tone.
There's an element of, kind of the Lego movie universe, which has a lot of humor in it. And I love humor and have always tried to use it in my films. And I think I wanted to keep that playfulness going in the mix, and there are a number of places where I feel like we get jokes out of sound design, or mixing, just many little things. Like I remember in the scene where we're watching the Rump Shaker video and we cut to his parents' living room. And suddenly the sound from the video goes down to the television and the grandma's pouring coffee and doesn't even notice she's overflowing it. And the way the splash hits the ground is funny. And like, we didn't have that in our temp mix at all, but that was one of those like fun little things. Like there were a bunch of those we found of like fun little moments we could underline with the design and the mix. And so anyway, I encouraged that. And these guys were great at coming up with those.
We were grateful that Morgan was open. I was a little anxious because, we've done some very creative stuff, I think, in the past, but, documentary is, you can't put, comic sounds, you don't get a whole lot of head pops in documentary. And so we were kind of, in preparation, we were going big and, trying to have lots of options. And I was like, I don't know if he's going to go for this. And Morgan was very receptive. And the other thing I think is ironic about this film is that, we've worked on a handful of animated movies. And the irony is sometimes you work on an animated movie and you put sounds in there and the filmmakers think they're making a documentary. They're like, oh, you'd never hear that in this movie. Like, that's a cartoon dog. What do you mean? So, but animated filmmakers have spent a lot of time and they're telling a story in their medium. And so they can be sensitive to things that perhaps diminish it in a way that's comedic when it shouldn't be or whatever. And I love that Morgan's making a documentary and he embraced all of this a bit more zany or just, off, out of the box kind of sound and opportunities. And I think that it is just all part of the overall style of this movie, which is, it's just, what can we do to be special, to surprise the audience, and to be as creative as our minds will let us, and then from there corral it so that it works within the scene. And so we had a blast just doing all kinds of stuff that was like, this looks, and a lot of it was just a playground. It's like, I really want to play with what is happening visually here. So I'm going to do a bunch of sound design for this and just run it by Morgan and see what he says. And more often than not, he was like, yeah, that works. And I was like, thank you.
Yeah, the head exploding thing was, I think, an example of that. Al had prepared every possibility of how that could play. And, my instinct is always to, well, if we got it, let's go big, and then I think ultimately we kind of pared it down a little bit and just went for the funny, and it was there, and we played it, and it was fun.
I feel like you guys explored some really fun, maybe even a couple of Easter egg things in there. I may be completely out of my mind, but I feel like there's a moment Pharrell gives a track to the producer, and he tells the producer, don't listen to this until you get to Miami. Next scene, we're in the producer's hotel room in Miami. I feel like that's a little bit of an Apocalypse Now treatment on the ceiling fan in the hotel room in Miami. If I'm off base there, don't tell me. I just want to live with that little piece of Easter egg.
Yeah, I mean, part of that sound effect was in the original track.
Yeah, he's got this like in the track.
So that sound effect at the track led us to thinking about Apocalypse Now and a fan. He's in a room and there's a fan, and how are you going to shoot that? Well, Apocalypse Now, and so it was so many different things where a sound in a song or a word from an interview would suggest a visual, and then that visual suggested something that we could then add a different sound to. So, I mean, that's the kind of creative fun that we could do on this, which you can't normally do. I mean, things like, there's a giant water storm scene, and a giant maelstrom with a whirlpool. And that whole scene exists because one offhanded line where Busta Rhymes was saying, these manager types, when it doesn't go well, they get in their lifeboats with their life jackets and they abandon you, in the middle of the storm, and that, that ability to say, well, let's just take that metaphor and like run with it. And that scene was definitely the most complicated visually to do, and was maybe the biggest, kind of challenge sound wise for us in the film too.
And there's a lot of great themes that we were allowed to embrace sonically. I mean, there's a lot of water, Pharrell talks about, being underwater, and there's a lot of water themes, the waves, the ocean, that scene, in the swimming pool, obviously the opening sequence where we're underwater. And it's a fun sonic thing to grab onto and play with. The space theme, another, really fun theme to play with. And so as we were designing early on, we were coming up with ideas that were sort of water-based or space-based, or, things like that, and kind of finding your flavors to play with that you could then use as opportunities to enhance.
You got the water stuff, you got the space stuff. You also, just throw in the Blue Angels too. I mean, what another great sonic possibility.
Well, that's Virginia Beach.
Exactly. But Morgan, you brought up something, that you hit on this idea of representing the beats visually, like making a physical element that was going to be the beats. And I feel like that opened up this possibility of the beat vault, which I think is just kind of a genius idea. So can you talk a little bit about, how did that idea come to you? What sort of visually, kind of how you decided to depict the beat vault, and then Alan, Pete, what a great sonic opportunity for you.
As we were talking about this, Pharrell in his interviews talking about saving these beats, and, good beats won't stay down. They'll come back. And, we've got all these beats stored away. And I was just thinking, visually, how do we represent that? Well, what if he has like the back cave of beats, this kind of space? And, I will say we kind of made the film twice. We made the film once as a kind of quasi documentary, but basically cutting all the dialogue, using footage we had shot, using archive footage and music videos, using clips from other movies. I hired a kid out of art school to draw, to kind of do primitive storyboarding. So we had a version of the film that we showed to people, and were refined the storytelling and the beats. And then we went to the animation studio, Pure Imagination, and started working with them. And Howard Baker, our animation director, went back and started storyboarding at the very beginning. again. And so, I think that was a combination of, we had that idea for the space, but really then when we started working with the animators and Howard, we started working on production design and what's that going to look like. And then, a bunch of ideas came in to kind of scale it, and I think Howard is one who really pushed for the idea of visualizing the beats in a way that hadn't quite occurred to me in the same way going into animation. But that was a huge contribution. And, so it just kept growing over these years. And I do seem to remember that I showed you guys that Frankenstein cut before we even storyboarded the film, where you could see the primitive kind of a radio edit with random images filling the whole thing in.
Tell me a little bit about that beat vault, because I felt like you sonically, you kind of created, there's also like an element of the sacred, like this is almost like a church. It feels, it's very reverberant, very, very, it's a place where magical things, spiritual things happen. And I feel like you used the sound design to give me that sense.
There's that sort of Mission Impossible 007 elevator that, takes us there, and the big heavy door opens, and it's like, this place is only for the very select few. This is where Pharrell has created, his special space. And for me, just seeing it visually, I was like, okay, well, and I don't even think there wasn't music until he walks over to the other side and he's talking about the Prince beat. And so there's all of these amazing opportunities and the way that the beat is moving. And so what we did, which was challenging but really fun, is we reverse engineered from the moment where the Prince beat starts. And we took those sounds and we recorded a bunch of Foley and a bunch of like Tupperware and all kinds of different sounds that were sort of tactile, plasticky kind of things that would attach themselves to that image. And then we used the BPM of the rhythm and kind of started attaching those things to this jumping around device, and it was a blast. And then, putting it in that atmosphere, and Morgan specifically said, I want this place to feel vast and special and unique and like a church. So we had a very unique ambience in there. And, we created it as if there wasn't anything there. There was no sound. So it was really an opportunity to go as far and as musically, as musical with our design as we could. And so we concocted all this and then put it in front of Pete, and he evolves it and morphs it into then this Prince. And then out of that, the Prince beat starts, and then the synesthesia comes in, and we had all different sounds for that as well. Because then we cut to the next scene where his friend's talking about it, and he's reaching for them, and they're zipping past him. So all of these things that don't have a sound that you can attach to them, we had to come up with that. And it was really fun to experiment. And again, thankfully, Morgan was pleased with what we did.
I think that I was surprised at how emotional the movie made me. We've been talking about using the sound design to achieve a very, joyful and kind of playful tone. But you also managed to bring real pathos, I think, to Pharrell's story. I had a number of conversations at Telluride with people after the movie, and we all talked about, the happy sequence and kind of the darker side of that song for Pharrell. Can you talk a little bit about? I think I had this fear that maybe the animation would kind of separate me from sort of the darker, more emotional parts of the story, but it actually reinforced them in an interesting way that I'd love for you to talk about, and how the sound design kind of reinforces those tonal shifts that you were able to accomplish.
Well, that's great to hear. I think it was one of our biggest concerns when we started the film, which is, how does emotion translate? The human face is one of the, maybe my favorite thing to film, and so suddenly we've got talking head interviews with minifigs, that have no nose or ears, and so what kind of emotion are you going to get out of it? And we didn't know. I mean, it was a real concern, and something that we really did work hard on our kind of animation of those sequences to get the face as right as we could get it, but started to realize that people do fill in a lot of that, and in a way maybe even fill in for some of themselves because of the low resolution of what Lego is. I think you kind of fill it in a little bit with your mind. And then sonically, we had that song, and then we started to deconstruct the song as it goes into that part of our discussion. And I've also got to give a shout out to our other composer, Mike Andrews, who did a lot of kind of incidental pieces of music and some original score, and also did some kind of layering on top of Pharrell songs. So that song starts as the Happy We Know, and then becomes a kind of deconstructed happy, and then a score starts to weave into the deconstruction, and then it morphs into something completely different. So just kind of on a musical level, it's gradually morphing into this kind of bittersweet tone. And then all those elements, these guys added all these other incredible things that then accentuated that transformation. And that was something we all worked incredibly hard on, because it's such an unusual, how do you make happy something that's the opposite of happy, without ever noticing, it just slowly transforms, and so that was one of the things I'm proudest of in the film.
When we watched that rough cut that you sent, the emotion was already there, right? So the story has it, it's there. But I knew that we were going to have fun when we got the animation, but would it put up that wall? And it really didn't. I think it just became sort of an invisible thing, and it enabled things like, I think part of the emotion is, or the ability to have someone feel emotion is surprise, so, you can have someone singing in the studio, and then suddenly the studio is filling up with water, and then it bursts and you're overwhelmed. And, that's something that you can't see coming. And that sort of lends itself to, being more emotional. I think the other thing about like Happy, even just the simple thing of like, we're in the bathroom with him and he's got his kid, and he starts to sing it, and we have the isolated vocal. And so immediately you're taking, you're stepping right up to him and his voice, and that contains the emotion. And so I think, that and the visual language that Morgan developed with the animation and the sound design that Al did, I'm just reaching for whatever's there and trying to make it work together into, something.
Now, one thing that many people have told me, is that they forget they're watching a Lego movie when they're watching it, which I take as a compliment in spite of all the effort that went into everything. I think it's good when you stop thinking about the medium and just think about the characters in the story. So that makes me happy. And the sound and all of that feed into that.
Pete, I wanted to ask you brought up Dolby Atmos a little bit earlier in the synesthesia conversation, and how you kind of used the, Atmos to kind of, take us into Pharrell's experience of this kind of sensory overload. I would love for you to tell us, are there other moments when you were able to use Atmos to kind of really open up and play in the track?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And everywhere with the music, because it just lends itself so much to, letting the music immerse us. But also Blue Angels. I mean, I can put the Blue Angels in the ceiling, and the surrounds are full range, so I'm not missing anything, in a normal 5.1 setup. As it goes to the back, you lose all the low end. But no, you just keep all that. So, I feel like that's one of the things that was really fun on this, particular Atmos mix is being able to fly things around like that.
This movie is stunning in Dolby Vision as well as Dolby Atmos. And, the way you use the the colors and the contrast, especially in the synesthesia sequences, it's really, it's really stunning. So I'm hoping that as many people as possible get the chance to see this movie in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos.
I agree. It's funny. There aren't a lot of documentaries in Dolby Vision. So is this the first one? I don't know. It's got to be up there. But it's interesting because I went and I kind of talked to the technicians and I did the demo and I kind of really saw what it could do. And for this film in particular, just there's a whole color story that happens in this film. I mean, obviously color is kind of synonymous with how Pharrell sees sound, which is interesting. But I even think there's a color story in the film where when he's most inspired, the color is most saturated. And in the middle of the film, when he gets lost, I guess, whether it's in the water or outer space, like the film gets very desaturated. And then when he kind of finds his mojo again, the color comes back in a big way with like the Daft Punk scene, something like that. And that's a scene that we just leaned into the color as much as we could. And watching that in Dolby Vision, it's something that it feels kind of otherworldly, in a great way. It just feels as vibrant as you want the color to feel, because that was the whole point of what we were trying to do visually with our color space too.
I always love to take an opportunity, when you got a director and a sound team that have collaborated for as long as you guys have collaborated, just to kind of acknowledge what a rare thing that is in our business and to kind of celebrate that. Morgan, what do Al and Pete bring to the table? Why do you keep coming back to these guys again and again?
Like I said before, the mix is one of my very favorite parts of the process, but also, it's from my first experience with them where it feels like there's like magic pixie dust that gets put on your film. And suddenly it goes from being kind of a rough cut or a fine cut or whatever you've been living with and just, oh, it's a movie now. Oh, look, I know how they did that. There was some magic that just happened, but suddenly it starts to become a movie, by the time I leave the mix, it's been elevated in some way that I still can't articulate. But particularly these two guys are both immensely talented, but also I feel like we have a good shorthand, but also, we just, I think have very similar sensibilities, in terms of what we like to do. And there are many different things over the years. All of us have interest in music too. We've done a lot with that too. I think I've even gotten Al to add some little bits of music on things on various projects. It's like, so I feel like we're all speaking a similar language and come from a similar kind of place of creativity and passion. And so, it's a great collaboration that I'm very grateful for. So thank you guys.
I think that's a great place to end. Morgan, Al, Pete, thank you guys so much for coming on the Dolby podcast today to talk about Piece by Piece. I love this movie so much. I'm so excited for you to bring it out into the world and for people to start responding to it. It was just a breathtaking surprise, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn.
Many thanks to Morgan, Al, and Pete for joining us today, and an extra special thanks to our friends at Focus Features, Universal Pictures, and Skywalker Sound for helping put this conversation together and for providing those clips. Be sure to check out Piece by Piece, now in theaters and Dolby Cinemas in stunning Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. We have links to tickets, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Creator Talks podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon, and our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.